On this episode, we visit the Boston Harborwalk. Then we talk with the Executive Director of WalkBoston. Finally, we'll look at the problem of bicycles on the sidewalk in Somerville. Stay tuned. We're in Boston talking with Richard McGinnis. Who do you work for?
I work for the Boston Redevelopment Authority. I'm Deputy Director for Waterfront Planning.
And what does a waterfront planner do?
Well, we conduct the city's master planning efforts for all of our waterfront neighborhoods. We then make sure that it's encoded in zoning, and we also guide new projects through our economic development department to make sure they're consistent with their master planning.
And what sort of things would be in a waterfront master plan?
Well, I think our kind of base infrastructure, our planning principle is public access, or a harbor walk system. Boston has about 47 miles of shoreline, and there's 39 miles of public access along the water's edge, available 24 hours a day, connecting neighborhoods to the beaches, the parks, water transportation. I'd say that's our core principle for waterfront planning.
And Boston's been around a long time. Waterfront's been developed. When did you start working on creating a harbor walk?
Well, if you look at Boston's history, we've always been tied to the waterfront since it was settled in the 1640s. That's how you would get to Boston, is by sea. And the fishing industry, importing, exporting, there was all this strong connection to the sea. But in the 1950s, you saw a consolidation of port activities, the dwindling fish stock offshore. So the fisheries, the fish processing facilities and fishing facilities were diminishing. The water quality became less and less clean, and access to the waterfront was cut off by highways or other infrastructure. So the Boston Redevelopment Authority, which was formed in the 1950s, its main focus was on urban renewal, rehabbing the city, for the 20th century. And public access to the waterfront was one of the core principles. It was mainly through a series of parks and plazas, but Harbor Walk started to grow off of that as new projects started to get permitted. We were able to leverage colonial state law, Chapter 91, Mass General Law, Chapter 91, to require public access and have continuous shoreline access. So you could have a walkway on private property that connects to a walkway on public property.
How difficult has it been over the decades to assemble all the links to make the harbor walk?
I mean, it's taken, I think we first started the harbor walk effort in the early 1980s, and, it's been slow. We rely on economic development, especially with private property. We have to rely on that development, changing hands and redeveloping it. We often get challenged by someone saying, why would I build Harbor Walk? It's just going to dead end at the next property. And we're like, we're fine with dead ends because eventually they'll be connected. And now we've got 39 miles of pretty much continuous connection. So it's been a long planning effort, but we're slowly getting there.
So who uses the Harbor Walk? Who am I going to see when I go for a stroll along there?
I'm going to see every demographic. You're going to see, in the neighborhood. So our North End neighborhood, Charlestown, East Boston, Dorchester, South Boston. So you're going to see the power walkers in the morning using it. You're going to see people on weekends going down with their families to open spaces adjacent to Harbor Walk. You're going to see a lot of tourists in downtown, connecting to the Freedom Trail. A lot of people utilizing our water transportation services may, just be walking on Harbor Walk but don't realize they're part of a system. There are a lot of nonprofit walks along the water's edge that now utilize the right-of-way. So, multiple uses.
I mean, there's one thing, they have infrastructure there. Some places have programming to, sort of create activity. Do you do any of that?
We do. Our goal is to make sure that Harbor Walk isn't privatized and it's used year-round. So we want to make sure that the uses adjacent to it are year-round, like restaurants. Restaurants are one of the best way to activate Harbor Walk. Why would you go out to the water's edge in February? Well, if there's a great restaurant down there, you would. Water transportation is another way to activate it. People connecting to Cape Cod, to Hingham, Quincy, Logan Airport, and harbor ferries to our waterfront neighborhoods. You could locate a marina is another way to activate it, where marinas are more seasonal, but, more people down to the water's edge. So we are involved in programming, the uses, but also the actual program of what's happening on the open space along Harborwalk.
And the American Planning Association is meeting here this week. What can planners in other harbor towns learn from what you've done with your harbor walk?
Well, I think the most important thing is to make sure the water is clean. The two public works improvements that significantly changed Boston's future was the cleanup of Boston Harbor, making sure that our beaches are now swimmable, that buildings don't turn their backs to it, but then also the Central Artery Project, which removed a highway from our downtown core that separated the waterfront. So, making sure that public access, physical public access, but also the psychological perception. I mean, just the polluted harbors of Boston water are notorious outside of the city, nationally, and that was a big effort. And I think once you do those things, or you remove the barriers, then the development will happen. The value will build into your waterfront, and if you have the easements and right-of-ways built into your zoning and permit requirements, you can get the same public access.
We're in Boston, Massachusetts, talking with Wendy Landman, who's Executive Director of WalkBoston. What is WalkBoston?
WalkBoston is Massachusetts' main pedestrian advocacy organization, and our work really falls into two big areas. One is we work on making the walking environment for everyday walking better, so we work on crosswalks and signal timing and speed limits and complete networks of sidewalks, everything that goes into making walking easy and convenient and fun and pleasant. And the second big set of things we do is programs to get people to walk more. So Safe Routes to Schools efforts, teaching teenagers how to do walking audits and thereby getting them to work on the physical environment and showing them how much fun it is to walk. We make fabulous walking maps. We lead walks, teach people about how to do advocacy. So that's who we are, and notwithstanding our name, we actually work around the state with lots of different communities, lots of different school programs, health programs, etc.
And you mentioned getting teenagers to work on walking audits.
Yep.
Sometimes teenagers can be tough to reach. How does that work? Getting them involved and doing things. How does that work?
So walking actually turns out to be a great thing to get teenagers involved with, because it's something that they can work on and have some successes on, because some of the fixes that they're looking at are really small. So two things. First, we always work with other organizations. So we partner with grassroots organizations who are already in the community, because we know that's what we need. There need to be people in the neighborhoods who have long-term engagement in the community. So that's one thing we always do. We have partners. And second, we often work with their youth workers who are used to working with teenagers. But for example, last year we partnered with an organization called Project Right, which is in a part of Boston with a lot of crime, a lot of street issues, who are very interested in getting kids engaged in the community. And with Project Right, we taught the kids how to do walking audits and then how to turn the information into the mayor's, basically the mayor's hotline for citizen complaints or citizen issues. And the kids turned in about, I think, 100 and some issues that they found, whether it was uneven sidewalks, trash that needed to be picked up, crosswalks that needed to be painted, etc. And within a couple of months, more than 70% of the things that they turned in had been fixed. So it was extremely empowering for the kids. Here they were working on an issue in their community, and lo and behold, they could see the results of their work. So I actually think walking is a great thing to work with teenagers on because of that. It's different than advocating for big social change where the time frame is going to be many years long. Here's something that the city actually wants to know what crosswalks need to be painted and can come in and do them. So it's actually, we think, a good thing to work on with teens.
Younger kids, you have the Safe Routes to Schools, been big around the country.
Right.
What have you been doing with Safe Routes to School lately?
Well, we have been doing for many years something called safety education for second graders, and that continues around the state, and we're doing that with the state's Safe Routes to Schools program. But we're actually also right now doing some really interesting research on safe routes to schools. We have funding from the Barr Foundation, which is the biggest Massachusetts private foundation. And we're working with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, also known as MAPC, who's actually doing the GIS work and the data analysis. And what we're looking at is we are trying to identify those school districts where there is a potential for substantial mode change from private vehicles to walking or biking, although with a focus on walking. And to do that, we were doing some really interesting research. So first what we did is looked at the school districts. There are 101 cities and towns in the MAPC district, to develop actual walk sheds around the schools. And to do that, we combined, or MAPC combined, information that the Mass Department of Transportation has about the location of sidewalks. And what we looked at also was roads with very low volume, very low speed roads, knowing that people walk on those streets, to develop actual walk sheds around all the schools in those 101 cities and towns. So what's a half-mile walk shed and what's a 1-mile walk shed, taking into account actual physical infrastructure as opposed to sort of circles around schools. And then we combined that with looking at the density of housing around those schools and creating an estimate of what percent of children within any given community live within a half-mile walk shed of the school or a 1-mile walk shed of the school, to give us a data set to work with to identify communities where a high percentage of children are likely to live within walking distance of schools. Then what we're doing is collecting information about how school assignment policies are made in each of those communities. So if it's a community that has a high density of kids living near schools, but the entire community does basically parent choice or school choice around the whole community, then kids are not likely to be going, or less likely to be going to their neighborhood schools. And then what we're going to do is a survey, a very brief parent survey, modeled actually on the survey that's used by the National Safe Routes to Schools Center, but much briefer, really getting at where the location of the children and the mode choice that's being made. So what we can do is see what percentage of children within walking distance of school are walking or being dropped off. And the point of this research is to identify those schools or those districts where the greatest potential exists to reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to school pickup and drop-off. Since about 20% of morning traffic is estimated to come from schools, this is a place where we think there's actually a lot of potential to get a crack at reducing greenhouse gas emissions over a relatively short term, which is something that a lot of people are looking for. How can we squeeze down greenhouse gas emissions from transportation?
And that 20%, a lot of people think, well, rush hour is people going to work, but there's actually a big school component there.
There's a very big school component. And as anybody who lives near a school or drives near a school in the morning knows, there's a lot of congestion around schools. And so this is, we think, a very interesting place to look for opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing, which you and I talked about a little bit, was this issue about pollution around schools, that what we're doing is creating hot spots of emissions around schools, which a lot of people think is actually contributing to the huge increase in asthma. So both off, but especially the idling, where parents are waiting in line to pick up their kids, or they arrive, let's say on the pickup side of things, they arrive, who knows, 5 minutes or 40 minutes before the children get out, and they sit in their cars with the car running. And so we're creating these pollution hotspots in exactly the places we don't want them. So another good reason to get kids out of cars and onto their feet.
And recently, the economy's not been so good. What can walking do for business?
Well, one of the things we've been working on is a new campaign, Good Walking is Good Business. And what we found is that this is really resonating with people in Massachusetts. What we have been doing, we've been tackling this on a couple of fronts. So first of all, we began last year our first Walker's Choice Award program to give retailers who make a particular contribution to the walking environment an award for doing so. And last year we gave the award to actually a Borders bookstore in downtown Boston, which is, among other things, has very long opening hours, which has really kept that corner of downtown Boston lively from 7 in the morning till 10 at night, which we think is actually inadvertently in a way, but nevertheless, very importantly, contributing to the pedestrian environment. But the store also, they have books outside, they have sale racks of books that they put outside, they have a cafe, they're very welcoming, people can come and sit there all day. So they're really helping create a good walking environment. So that's the first piece. And then the second piece, sort of building off that, is we realized that there's been a lot of research done lately on the importance of walking to a whole variety of different elements of the economy. And so what we did is we put together a brochure called Good Walking is Good Business that looks at the impacts of walkability on such things as retail sales, real estate values, transportation costs. In other words, people who don't need to use a car or can have one fewer car in their households actually have a lot more money to spend on other things because the cost of owning a car is so high. Looking at healthcare costs for businesses, so employers who have wellness programs where people are able to walk are reducing their healthcare costs. So many different ways in which walking is good for the economy and good for business. And when we've been talking about this new campaign, if you will, that we're doing with people in communities across Massachusetts, we literally were being asked to send the brochure out while it was in draft form because people wanted to use it with their local chambers of commerce, with their local boards of selectmen or city councilors, to work with them to talk about why making investments in walkability are so important to the economy of a community. So we're pretty excited about it. We're about to begin putting together what we're calling a roadshow, but a slideshow about this issue to show people examples of what we mean by walkability, and especially examples of low-cost ways to improve walkability. We realize that cities and towns are incredibly strapped for money. So this is not going to be, the gold-plated turn yourself into, the next Copenhagen. This is going to be, how do you make sure that your crosswalks are painted and there's some decent-looking street furniture and store windows are kept up, etc., things like that. So we're pretty excited about this campaign.
Another thing that people have heard a lot about lately is complete streets.
Right.
What are you doing about complete streets here in Massachusetts?
Okay, so first of all, Massachusetts Highway Design Guide, as we call it around here, but is actually a complete streets version of design guidelines for state projects. So we are lucky to have that on the books, and we're making progress in getting that implemented, certainly in state projects. And the city of Boston is now doing a very complete streets set of guidelines that they're calling multimodal, green, and smart. So they're actually looking not just at the multimodal aspects of complete streets, but also green streets, mostly or heavily to do with water and water runoff, and also smart streets. So using new technology to make sure that the next technologies that are coming are going to work here. So RIFD coding and electric charging stations for vehicles, etc. But as the city of Boston has been putting the Complete Streets guidelines together, one of the things that the Transportation Department has been thinking about is how to build support for that in the community. Because sometimes when you go out into the neighborhoods and suggest making changes in streets to make them more bicycle friendly, more walker friendly, more transit friendly, there's actually pushback in the community, especially where in a place like Boston, where you talk about taking some parking spaces away to make spaces for other uses, or you talk about taking some lanes away to make spaces for other uses. And I think we've certainly seen this around the country. So WalkBoston is now working with the Boston Transportation Department and the Boston Public Health Commission to train neighborhood residents about the importance of complete streets to public health. And especially in neighborhoods in Boston with the greatest health disparities, this is really important. Having people understand and stand up and speak out for the changes in communities to make them healthier is a really important piece of the Complete Streets movement in Boston. So we're really pleased to be working with the City of Boston, with these two agencies together, Health and Transportation. We're working with grassroots partners in those communities, and the Boston Public Health Commission has put out an RFP in the communities that we're working to ask grassroots organizations to come forward, put together a proposal about working with them, and then propose or bring to the table 2, 3, 4 participants apiece from the different grassroots organizations to basically participate in workshops and learn about the impacts of complete streets on health, to learn about walking, bicycling. There's a lot of work on nutrition too, better access to healthy food. So really running the full gamut of the, I guess I would call it health and food and fitness aspects of Complete Streets. And the reception in the communities has been terrific. People are really interested and excited about this, and we're bringing information to them that they really didn't know about. The idea that people actually walk more if it's safe to get across the streets and the sidewalks are attractive, or that people will bicycle more if there are bike lanes and places to park your bikes. So it's really a very exciting piece of work, and I think it's an important piece of Complete Streets and some of the work that's happening all around the country on Complete Streets, where we need to take that conversation beyond the if you will, the professional active transportation world and health world, and get it out to the broader community to explain how that works.
So having well-informed communities, well-informed public, then is a key piece of getting the changes that need to be made.
Absolutely. I think we're seeing the benefits of that in Boston already. The folks that have been participating in these workshops are coming to community meetings and speaking up for these issues and saying, no, we want to be able to get across the street. We want to be adding some open space areas where we can have a farmer's market in our neighborhood. We need space to put that out on the street. We want to see bike lanes and the promotion of bicycles. So yeah, we're actually seeing the fruits of that education already. So that's pretty exciting. And I think nationally, certainly the active transportation world has been seeing a lot of articles lately about some pushback that's happening in New York. And I think some of that is coming because people don't understand the changes that need to happen in American cities to make them more comfortable for people to get around under their own steam, and how important that's going to be for the quality of life, but also the healthiness of life. Americans are really suffering from many years of not moving enough. So we need to make our communities as the health world says, make the healthy choice the easy choice. So Complete Streets is an important piece of that.
We're in Somerville, Massachusetts, talking with Greg Hill. What's been your involvement with pedestrian issues over the years?
Well, John, I was a founding member of the Somerville Pedestrian Group, comprised mostly of seniors, of which I'm heading toward myself in a few years. We were concerned about the phenomena of public safety for pedestrians because starting in the mid-'90s, we started to see the phenomena of cyclists using the sidewalks in Somerville, and that is it's not a good thing. And apparently what's also happening around the country. Other cities have come to grips with this phenomena by forbidding cyclists to use the sidewalks in the business districts. Now, I don't think that should include people with disabilities, seniors, or the very young. I think obviously an exception has to be made, but I think what started it was the fact that I read in the paper, one of the things that got me going to start this organization was reading about an elderly woman who was hit by a sidewalk cyclist and injured. And while she was lying on the sidewalk, he got off his bike and bawled her out, and then got back on his bike and continued on his way. That was, I guess, what you'd call an epiphany.
What's the law about cycling on sidewalks in Somerville?
Well, basically, the law in Somerville forbids cycling in the business districts, in the major city squares, and it's been demarcated by signage. However, there is no enforcement, and there's been no public education on the issue, even though we came to the Board of Aldermen. We came to City Hall back in 1995, and we talked to then Alderman and now Mayor Joseph Curtatone. He was on the appropriate committee of the Board of Aldermen. The aldermen have shown have shown far more initiative on the issue than the administration.
Are there facilities in the roads for the cyclists? Do you have bike lanes and that sort of thing?
They have been putting in bike lanes. I will admit that cycling can be a challenge, in a small congested city like Somerville, where the housing is very dense. But that's no reason to be cycling on the sidewalks in the squares. And believe me, many seniors and people with disabilities have complained about this phenomena that's been ongoing, ever since the mid-90s.
Have other jurisdictions in this area had any better luck getting the bicyclists to ride in the street rather than the sidewalks?
Well, Cambridge has had an ordinance in place when Cambridge residents complained about the phenomena happening there. And yes, the city did put signage up and also demarcate where the business districts were. But against enforcement in Cambridge is very sporadic. Although I think the residents of Cambridge are better informed about it, so you tend to see it less. Like I work in Central Square, Cambridge, and I see it only occasionally. So I think people are better informed. But in Somerville, there's been no public education campaign, even though requested it. They are going to start one, a bike safety campaign, finally. But this issue has been before City Hall since 1995, 96. And that's a long time coming, believe me.
What do you think it would take to do the trick here, to get cyclists to recognize where they're supposed to ride and actually ride in the street rather than on the sidewalk?
Well, I think a public information campaign for one, and I think hopefully the city is going to take it seriously this time. They say they are. We'll see. Just to get the information out to Somerville residents through any number of ways, through the schools, through the bike shops, wherever. And also what is needed is enforcement. As to whether any enforcement will come following a public information campaign, I don't know whether it will happen or not. There seems to be no inclination on the part of the City Hall for any kind of enforcement. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what good is a public safety campaign if there's no enforcement?
Visit us on the internet at www.pedestrians.org.